Welcome to Module 1 on the sociological imagination. In this module, we're going to look at the basics of sociology and explore definitions of the sociological imagination. In the following section, without a video, you're going to be prompted to investigate examples of the sociological imagination and social movements with some questions about anti-racism and beauty politics. We're also going to be applying the sociological imagination to Black Lives Matter. In separate sections of this module, we will also look at the sociology of sociology, looking at specific figures in sociology. And there will be more content that looks at the sociological perspectives that follows. So again, welcome to Introduction to Sociology and to Module 2. I want to start by finally offering you a definition of sociology. You've probably already read that at least a couple of times in your text. But to clarify, sociology is the study of human society. We look at human behavior and human interactions. In particular, we look at interactions in groups and in intimate relationships, and interactions between humans and their environments and social institutions. We'll define some of these terms later because I know that they're pretty abstract and pretty vague. Sociologists study society from two different levels of analysis. One level is micro-level analysis, and that's looking at smaller groups and smaller interactions and everyday meanings and interpretations. The other level is macro-level analysis, and this is looking at larger scale interactions across entire societies and with social institutions, and it's just like pretty large level variables that we're looking at here. It's important to understand the definition of the term society early on because in everyday communication, we use this term interchangeably to mean different things. A society is typically people who live in the same territory and are relatively independent of people outside of their area. And they tend to participate in a common culture. Societies are the largest forms of human groups, and they often consist of people who share a common heritage. Usually the members of a society learn culture and transmit it from generation to generation, and they work to preserve that culture. So societies can be, for example, connected by location in the universe. So you could say that we have a global society. They could be determined by continental divides. And so you could say that there's a North American society or society of the Americas or of Europe. Often societies are looked at by national boundaries or geopolitical boundaries. And so we'll say that there is a American society, specifically US of A, America here. Or we'll say that perhaps it's Middle Eastern society or something like that. One important element of society, and I've already mentioned this in our description, is culture. And the culture definition we'll come into in a future module in greater detail. But really, culture is the totality of everything connected with a society and its people. It's all of the values, the ideas, the beliefs, and all of the elements of physical manifestations of culture, like the cutlery that we use, the art that we have, or even just the food that we eat. Another term that I want to define here is social institution, because this is a really huge concept for our macro level analysis, no pun intended. So a social institution, again, is a very abstract term. We use this often, but if you were to ask somebody to define what a social institution is, it will be probably like really difficult for them to come up with a proper sociological definition. So social institutions are really complex groups of interdependent positions that together perform a role and reproduce themselves throughout society. So our main social institutions in society are the family, right? So for the United States, we will look at what are the ideas, what are the positions that make up the family? What are the expectations when we say the family across society? Others would be education, research, I'm sorry, not research, religion. My research often is on religion. Let's see what else we have. Government and work and economy, the media, healthcare, and so on. Your text gives you a more specific and exhaustive listing of our social institutions and how you can detect what is a social institution. And next, we look at the sociological imagination and what that means. In general, it's the ability to see the connections between our personal experiences and the bigger picture, between micro and macro. So, how do our personal experiences connect to broader society and to history altogether? So the sociological imagination is a term coined by C. Wright Mills, who is an American sociologist who was at Columbia University for about 16 years around the middle of the 20th century until he died. Rest in peace, C. Wright Mills. And he was an advocate for public and political engagement. He also was a bit controversial during his time. He interviewed Fidel Castro while living in Cuba. Imagine what that was like in the middle of the 20th century, and how big of a file the FBI must have had on him. And C. Wright Mills emphasized the importance of seeing things from the perspectives of others, and again, those connections and differences between personal experiences and greater social factors. He said that the sociological imagination leads to curiosity, and that curiosity for the sociologist is an insatiable curiosity. And really, that makes you into a skeptic, learning to think critically and not to simply accept things as what is. Sociologists are often accused of thinking too much about things or asking unimportant questions as a result of our curiosity. We ask often questions that others don't ask, and we ask questions from the larger scale all the way down to the most minute details. We want to know why, and we don't want to just accept that things are what they are just because they are. The sociological imagination has three important components. One is perspective, that ability to see things from various perspectives outside of your personal experience and learned experience. The second is the strange. One element of the sociological imagination is taking that which is familiar to you and looking at it as if though it's strange. Right? So taking all the things that you've learned in all of your adolescence and adulthood, all of the ways you've been socialized, and all of the behaviors that you think of as normal, and trying to look at them as an outsider would, trying to make those familiar elements of your life feel a bit strange, and to be able to critically analyze what you think of as normal and everyday and commonplace. And then connection. Seeing connections between personal experiences or personal or private issues and greater social factors and institutions or public issues. So being able to look at, for example, why a person has lost their job and seeing how there can be private explanations that may or may not be impacted by public issues. So if someone has lost their job because they're bad at it because they have a bad attitude, or because they are late to work very often and don't make up that time, we would say that that's pretty much a private issue and that there are no public issues really influencing that. Again, with sociology, it's all about perspective. And so sometimes even things that look like they're private issues, like the ones I just described in this example, can actually turn out to be public. But for the sake of this example, let's just think of those as being only private. Public issues, however, that can influence somebody being fired from their job would be things like a recession or some other issues with the economy. It could be something like corporate greed and sending jobs overseas so that they can avoid the high salaries or to avoid taxation, right? And so sociologists work hard to be a bit skeptical so that they can look at connections and determine the micro level or macro level analysis of phenomena. So to further illustrate, I'd like to turn to some examples by two of my favorite non-sociologists, Hank and John Green. Hank and John Green are pretty famous. John Green especially is an author. You've probably seen his books, many which have been turned into movies. Hank Green is just super intelligent, and they're both pretty awesome people. They have podcasts and popular YouTube channels, and they've created the series on YouTube, Crash Course, which has lots of educational materials, some that I use supplementarily in this course. So Hank Green, the little brother of the two, has commented that we all have to exist inside of the systems that we exist in and have very little overall control. And that statement is an acknowledgement of how we as individuals are a part of a bigger picture. And it emphasizes how society and social institutions actually have a lot of influence over our everyday behaviors and interactions and decisions. Hank Green also states in the same podcast, we are influenced by the language we speak. We can't have a thought for something that there isn't a word for. Language, of course, is a part of our society and our culture, and it influences even how we think, right? So the language that our society has developed, accepted, and adopted is impacting not just how we communicate with one another, but even our capacity for thought. And during this podcast, the big brother, John Green, actually states, and this I think is the best of the quotes that they gave during that podcast related to this course. There is no me separate from the rest of the world. There is no me separate from my circumstances. What do you think that means? Who are you separate from the rest of the world? Who are you separate from your circumstances? What if you had no family? What if you were a recluse or a hermit, maybe, and you were separated completely from society? Who are you and what would your identity be? And how would that be different from the you who is obviously participating in society right now, and the identities and preferences that are attached to that sense of self?